Welcome to Bloomerang Academy, and thank you so much for joining us today, where we are talking about how to set up your database for success. My name is Diana Otero, and I will be your instructor for today. Thinking about data at a high level can inform and streamline the small details in your database. In this class, we will discuss some terminology and best practices, why it matters to keep everyone aware of the hows and whys of your database, and how to prepare for a worst case scenario before disaster strikes. So we'll take a look at why clean data matters. We'll spend a lot of time in our settings section in Bloomerang. We'll talk about the difference between raised and revenue. We'll look at how you can use this data for your list segmentation and how you can use your custom fields. We'll also take a look at some succession planning. So first, why does clean data matter? Simply put, clean data allows your team's focus to remain on fundraising and constituent cultivation and stewardship, instead of constantly questioning the integrity of your data. Trusting that your entire team understands what needs to be in the database, how it should be entered, and why is very important. This will not only make your team more dynamic and functional, but it will also ensure your efforts aren't being duplicated, audits will run more smoothly, and everyone will be clear on expectations, both internally and externally, when it comes to your constituents. Every decision your team makes directly impacts your mission and your return on investment. And this is one place that you can really focus some efforts to make sure that those decisions are being made appropriately. Here's the side navigation in Bloomerang where, if you're an administrator in the database, you'll see your settings icon. If you don't see that settings icon, that means you are not an administrator in your database, and you can talk to whoever the administrator is to adjust your permissions if needed. This section houses your organization's unique data, so you want to make sure that it's accurate and up to date. This is where you can update things like your individual organization contact information, turn on your NCOA processing, link accounting software, set your NTEE codes, and your fiscal year start date. Knowing your NTEE code can be helpful for things like audits, tax forms that you're filling out, and other kinds of reporting for the industry, for grants, that sort of thing. You can also link to social media information, which can be really helpful. Make sure when you're thinking about that succession planning, with high turnover rates at some point or another, that could impact your organization. So having all this information accessible to future employees who may have to pick up that mantle and start using your social media accounts is really important. Now, let's show you what this looks like in the database. Right now, we are on our constituent dashboard. If you are an administrator in the database, you'll see that settings icon. If you're an administrator in the database, you'll see that if you're an administrator in the database, you'll see that settings icon. So you can click on that, and this shows you what information is under the hood, so to speak. So you'll have your organization data, your users, your custom fields, that would be for constituents, transactions, interactions, and notes. You can manage relationships, set up your email, and create any forms in Bloomerang. Under transactions, that's where you'll also find your funds, campaigns, appeals, as well as setting up your transaction processors. Now, in terms of your organization information, in Bloomerang, any field that you see that it's in green, that's a required field, so you have to fill that out. Other information is not required, but if you already have it, it's good to fill out that information. The email address here, it's important because any email notifications by default will go to that email address. So talk within your organization on who that email address should belong to or what that email address should be. This is also where you would indicate your website, your social media accounts, select your NTEE code, as well as input your fiscal year start. You don't have to put the end date. The system is smart enough to know or to figure out what the end date is based on what the start date is. This is also important to note because you can report on this field. So if you are running reports by date, you can choose if you're filtering, for example, by this year, that will go by calendar year, versus this fiscal year, which goes by the date that's in your organization settings. If we scroll down, you'll also see accounting preferences. If you are using one of our integrated accounting softwares, you can turn that on here. The setup is not done yet. There might be additional setup that's needed, but those will become available once you select what your accounting integration is. You'll also find your two-factor or your security settings here, which includes your two-factor authentication. This is an enhanced security measure that, when enabled, Bloomerang will send users an additional code to their authenticated email during login, and they will have to enter that code before they can log into your database. When you think about two-factor authentication, think about a user or a person needs to have two things in order to log into your database. The first is something they know. That would be their password. And the second one is something that they have or have access to. So in this case, it would be email. So it's not enough, for example, for someone to know the password. Let's say somebody hacks or guesses my password. They still need my email to be able to enter that to be able to enter that code to get into your database. You'll also have a database export here. This will export files for your Bloomerang database. So this is good as a backup. Bloomerang backs up your data as well, but it only goes back so far. So any major changes that you'd like to do to your with your database or within your database, you can always create a backup before you make that change. This is also where you would turn on your NCOA processing. This is National Change of Address. It's already turned on in my database, so it says View NCOA Dashboard. If this hasn't been turned on in your database yet, it is going to say Activate NCOA Processing. This is free for standard licenses within Bloomerang. If you're not seeing this section, if you're not seeing this button, you may not have a standard license. So you can contact our customer success team and you can upgrade so this comes free with your standard database. It does come free with a standard database, but you do need to turn it on. You'll also have, if you have an older database like mine, you'll have your API keys v1. Most of you will be on v2. So no worries if you don't see this in your database. Let's go back to our settings here. I also wanted to take a look at the different users you can have in the database. You can create an unlimited amount of users within your Bloomerang database, so there is absolutely no need to share usernames and passwords. Once you create a new user, you'll also be able to set their permissions. You can have an administrator user who has access to everything, or within the standard user permission, you can select which areas of the database they have read-only or edit access to, or which data of the database they can or cannot access. Settings is where you would also configure your custom fields, as well as your funds, campaigns, and appeals. When creating your funds, campaigns, and appeals, we'll talk more about that. But when you're creating them, this is the section you would go to. So go to your settings, transactions, and you can create your funds, campaigns, and appeals. You can create an unlimited number of funds, campaigns, and appeals. You can also deactivate any funds, campaigns, appeals that you no longer use, or you can rename your custom fields. Any transactions, for example, that already are tagged with that fund, campaign, or appeal, if you change the name of that fund, campaign, or appeal, the transactions already tagged with that will inherit that change. So let's talk more about funds, campaigns, and appeals. Since most nonprofits raise the majority of their funds through some sort of fundraising efforts, I would really recommend discussing internally how you set up your transaction information in the database to ensure consistent data entry and clear reporting. In Bloomerang, the largest of campaigns, funds, and appeals is campaigns. And by largest, I mean in terms of scope. Specifically, campaigns are overarching fundraising efforts. They have a definite financial goal, and it's within a specific date range. You have a start date and an end date. You'll notice that when you go into your dashboard, you can track the campaign progress on your dashboard. And this goes by whether the campaign is active and it has a goal, and you have that set start and end date. Most nonprofits only have a few campaigns going into any given fiscal year. You have your annual campaign, which has the goal of raising the monies you need to keep the lights on or to provide services to your consumers, pay salaries. It's basically that minimum amount of money that you need to keep things going. If your organization is purchasing assets like buildings, furniture, technology, you'll likely put that under a capital campaign. And then finally, you would have campaigns for your large events with a lot of moving parts and clear goals. This could be galas, golf tournaments, 5Ks, or other runs. Those can absolutely necessitate a separate campaign depending on how big they are. I will note that in Bloomerang, each campaign typically is entered with the years attached or associated with the campaign. For example, capital campaigns are oftentimes multi-year efforts. So for example, naming it like your 2020 to 2025 capital campaign can be really important to know which capital effort it belongs to. And then once that campaign is finished, you should deactivate it after that effort. You should never reactivate a capital campaign 10 years later and continue using that one. You can still report on deactivated campaigns, but it will make your data entry cleaner and ensure things aren't getting stuck in places that they shouldn't be. Funds, however, are essentially individual buckets of money. It's where the money is going or it's where it's being allocated. This is a silly example, but for example, you have a fund called Cookies. The assumption for that fund is that the money raised is going toward purchasing the cookies, not that the money came in from a bake sale. The number of funds that a nonprofit has varies widely depending on what is being done with the money coming in. All nonprofits should have some kind of unrestricted fund. You may also have heard this called general fund, where it's most needed. This means that it's not allocated for a specific purpose and it is at the discretion of your nonprofit. So make sure you have that general bucket of money or unrestricted fund listed. And then depending on the types of programming you do and how your donors can designate monies, you may need a separate fund for each program, or you may need just a general program fund. Scholarships are another example of specific funds that you might need at your nonprofit. As a note, your major event should not necessarily have a fund or not have an event fund unless people are paying money to support that event. So for example, money is going toward supporting the golf outing, not necessarily for the nonprofit. So make sure that the fund associated with your events are wherever the money is going toward. If you're integrating Bloomerang with an accounting software, make sure to check with your accountant on how things should be set up and how they can and should map to your accounting software. Appeals are how the money is coming into your organization. It's any way or any method you're asking for money to come into your organization. Going back to those large scale events, those could have multiple appeals tied to it. Using golf as an example, you might have a sponsorship appeal, or you might have a ticket purchase appeal or a player appeal. I always recommend having either like an invitation or an appeal card or an RSVP. For anyone who says no, they're not coming, they might still send you money to support the players or runners or other types of participants. All those can be separate appeals because the reason that they're giving money, how they're bringing in the money, all of that just differs slightly. And that's information that most nonprofits do need to track for those large events. So think about that. You know your organization best and what works best for your nonprofit. One question I get asked pretty regularly is, do I need an appeal by year? And the short answer is no, not necessarily. There are some appeals that make sense to have kind of just a static appeal. For example, if you do a golf outing every single year, but there are other types of appeals as well. And it's the same type of appeals coming in, sponsorship, players, etc. When reporting, you can always filter by campaign, plus appeal, plus the date range. There are times, however, where it does make sense to have dates on your appeals. Some examples I've seen could be the year-end appeal. Oftentimes, nonprofits want to see how their year-end appeal stacks up against other ones, and putting a date range on that can be really helpful. Special requests, natural disasters, the pandemic, those kinds of things, it also makes sense. For example, an earthquake. If you live in an area that's earthquake prone, it could be helpful for future employees to see that you've done a special appeal for every earthquake versus one specific appeal at some point. Whatever you decide on, be consistent. Talk amongst yourselves and document it. If you're going to put a date on your year-end appeals, make sure you're putting a date on all your year-end appeals. If you're going to have just a sponsorship appeal, just make sure you have a sponsorship appeal. Take a look at what's in there, even what's deactivated, and you can use that as a guide for how to move forward in your next fiscal year. It's also important when you're documenting how to enter this information that you document why, so the next person understands what you're trying to do, and also document it if there's a change. For example, up to this point, funds, campaigns, and appeals have been entered one way, and you want to change that moving forward. Document that for folks of, this is the date that we made a change. If you're looking to report on data before this date, this is how that's entered, and this is how you report on it. This is how you enter it moving forward. That's very helpful to know. Another question we often get is, how can you retroactively correct data? For those of you who are coming into a database that's you didn't set up, and maybe that's something you inherited, take a look at how that's set up in the past, if they don't have that documented, and take a look at how you want to set that up moving forward. There are tools within Bloomerang where you can do a mass update of your funds, campaigns, and appeals, for example. We're not going to go into detail in this class, but that is an available tool for you. Now, putting this all together of funds, campaigns, and appeals, funds are the only required field. However, try to fill in as much information as you can at the point of data entry. Talk through and document your data entry procedures so you don't have to spend a lot of time correcting that data afterwards. Now, typically transactions only have one fund, campaign, or appeal associated with them. But there are some cases where you might receive a donation from a donor that is designated to two different funds, for example. And the one that we have in the slide, let's say $500 goes to the unrestricted fund and $500 goes to programs, you can use split payments instead. We're not going to go into detail today, but I have linked this resource for you. The next thing I want to talk about is raised versus revenue. Raised are dollars committed plus dollars that have actually been received. So this is future gifts plus cash in the door. In terms of transaction types, this includes your donations, pledges, and recurring donation payments. Revenue is actual dollars received. This is cash already in the door. So this would be your donations, pledge payments, and recurring donation payments. The difference between the two here is whether you're counting the pledge or the pledge payment. The reason that we make this distinction is that it is really helpful, especially in really large efforts, such as a capital campaign, to track your pledges versus the actual pledge payments that have already come in. You have that expectation of money coming in, but what has actually been collected. It can also help you plan for the possibility of what you need to make up to reach your goal, especially for the possibility that pledge payments may not come in time, or if you have multi-year pledges where the pledge payments extends beyond the particular date range that you're looking at. Also important to note that soft credits is neither raised nor revenue. We'll take a look here in a little bit at a report that takes a look at the different amounts, but soft credits are neither raised nor revenue. But you can see all of these in reporting. A special note as well, when you're entering in-kind gifts, the amount typically should be entered as a $0 amount because it's not cashed in the door. It's a gift basket, or it's a car, or whatever item it is, or it's a service. It's actually the donor's responsibility to declare the value when they're claiming it on their taxes. Unless, for example, it might have come with an appraisal. If you have a value that you can associate with an in-kind gift, enter that in the fair market value field. And the reason you want to do this is when you're doing your reporting and when you have your columns for amount or raised or revenue, you don't want to confuse that money or that not actual money with or you don't want to count those in-kind values in your cash or in your raised revenue totals. Let's take a look at this in the database. I have a report that's open here. It's a transaction report. And what I want to highlight is you can take a look at different amount fields in your database. And what you want to look at depends on what you like to see and what you're going to do with that information. When you see a column for amount, this refers to everything. This is your donations, whether that's monetary or in kind. This is your pledges and pledge payments. This is your recurring donation schedules and payments, and your soft credits. So this encompasses all transaction types. And that's why you'll notice the total here, it is the biggest number compared to raise and revenue. You can also see here, I have a $0 amount that is likely an in-kind gift. And that's what I mean by I don't necessarily want to count the value of the in-kind donation in my totals. You also have raised amount versus revenue amount. So you can see here there is a slight difference between my raised and revenue amounts because that takes a look at raised, whether I'm counting the pledges, or revenue, whether I'm counting the pledge payments that are coming in. I personally like comparing these two, especially when I'm looking at a campaign and I'm looking at our projected goals and what we expect to come in versus what we've actually collected. So you can absolutely report on all of those fields. Just make sure that you're grabbing the right one so you have the right data for what you need. Now, we're talking about all of this because it really helps with your segmentation. And I want you to think about the data and how you're setting up your database in terms of how this is going to help you segment your data. I like to think of reporting as the way you make sense of the data in your database and kind of reverse engineering it in terms of what kind of segments do I want, what kind of segmentation do I want to do, helps inform what kind of data you want and how you want it set up in your database. First, why should we worry about segmentation? Well, frankly, it allows you to address your constituents with maximum impact. It allows you to personalize your communications to gain that maximum impact. For example, how you would reach out to a board member should be very different than how you reach out to a first-time donor. And when you're sending your solicitation letters, your messaging should be aimed specifically towards your different audiences. Board members and major donors should be different with your messaging than someone who only shows up to your events or so far has only volunteered with you. Also, it is very important to know who you are including in your segmentation, but it's equally important to know who should be excluded from certain mailings or communications. For example, your recurring donors should be taken out of your general appeal rotation, as should your major donor prospects that you're actively pursuing for major gifts. Also, potentially people who have open pledges. You know, if you're in the middle of paying down a $10,000 pledge, getting an appeal level for yet an additional dollar amount could potentially be frustrating. It may also be unwise to solicit certain populations at certain times. For example, if you're a hospice organization deciding to solicit the family of someone whose loved one just passed away could potentially be seen as pretty insensitive. Another example, soliciting someone who just recently left your homeless shelter for their first apartment. They probably don't have the funds to be giving back quite yet, but in the future, they absolutely could. And that's something you need to know. So excluding certain constituents can save a lot of money on paper appeals and a lot of unhappy people who feel it's inappropriate to be soliciting them at this time. It's all about keeping that donor relationship going. So the more you know about your donors and the more you can personalize your communications based on what you know about your donors, you are going to maximize that impact. Now, there's several ways to think about segmenting your data. We have Bloomerang donor groups, which allows you to segment by high-level metrics based on the donor lifecycle stage. For example, whether someone's a prospective donor or a current donor or a lapsed donor. Also by donor type, are they a new donor? Are they retained or were they recaptured? Or are they a recurring donor? Financials allow you to dig in based on individual gift or cumulative gift amounts. What funds, campaigns, appeals folks are giving to, what is the recency or frequency of giving, and all of that good financial data. Custom fields allow you to segment based on criteria that you set and is unique to your organization. When it comes to custom fields, I recommend two things. Number one, before you even create any of your custom fields, familiarize yourself with the default fields already in your Bloomerang database and how they are used. This will ensure that you don't create custom fields for fields that are already available and avoid confusion at data entry or doing reporting. Number two, create custom fields that illustrate your constituents' relationship to your organization. I know we have a relationship field in Bloomerang. I'm talking about, this is a different level of relationship. The relationship is something you would use for how constituents relate to each other. The custom fields you would use for how the constituent relates to your nonprofit. Some common examples of that would be current board members, former board members, volunteers, staff, former staff, members, alumni, a granting organization. Depending on what your organization does and what your different efforts are, this will impact what those fields are. But remember, we're talking about their relationship to you. And I recommend making this a pick multiple field because it's absolutely possible that someone can be a volunteer and a member of your museum, for example. So here's an example breakdown of segmentation by financial versus custom fields. Segmenting by financial data can take many different forms. Perhaps you would send one version of your letter to people who have been loyal donors and have given 500 or more every year for the last number of years. So for the last 3 years, for example, maybe you send a different version to people who gave less than 100 last year. You may even send one to everyone who gave 60 or more last year, asking them to become a recurring donor, or anyone who gave 1,000 or more last year and ask them to give a multi-year pledge. With that said, someone who gave $25 last year is probably not a good candidate for a $5,000 over a 3-year pledge. So finances can really impact what you're asking for, and it can really give you a grasp of what your target should be and what your return on investment for that appeal is going to be. I have some samples here from my pretend database, group 1 up to 100, group 4, 500 and plus. Again, this is going to vary based on your nonprofit. I like doing the reports to see what those different thresholds might be as well. On the custom field side, you can separate your donors based on factors that matter to your organization and current efforts. For example, number one segment could be, these are constituents who are going to receive my newsletters: major donors, board members, volunteers, recurring donors, alumni, versus constituents who are going to receive the appeals: past board members, volunteers, prospect, alumni. And you could have an overlap there, depending on what you're wanting to do. Make sure that it is planned for and that is a deliberate effort on your part. We are going to go back into our reporting here, and we're going to take a look at how might that look. I'm going to cancel out of here and create a new report. How might that look, let's say, if you were in a constituent report? And you can put all of this together. You can absolutely filter using your financial data in conjunction with the custom fields that you have. Actually, before we look at that, let's take a look at some of our donor. Let's take a look at our constituent dashboard. So I mentioned this a little bit earlier. You can filter based on the Bloomerang donor groups. That's based on the life cycle stage, as well as the donor types. So this is something automatic that Bloomerang picks up for you. If someone is a prospective donor, so they're cultivating, but have not yet made a first gift, they're a current donor, they've given within the last 13 months, or they've lapsed. They've given, but not within the last 13 months. It also automatically takes a look at for you which are new donors versus retained, recaptured, or recurring. If you ever need a refresher on what these means, you can click Learn More here. And you can incorporate this into your reporting. I have a new constituent report here. When I click Add Filter, I can search for Bloomerang donor groups. And this is where I can select if I want to take a look at current, prospective, or lapsed donor versus I want to take a look at new, retained, recapture, or recurring donor. So that's one field that you can filter by. So let's say this one is for current donors. Another thing I want to point out is whether you want to filter by constituent or by household. So right now I'm filtering by constituent, which means that it is looking at individual constituent levels. If I want to change this to household, it doesn't mean that this report only looks at household. It just means that, for example, if I have donations on my timeline and my husband doesn't, because one of us meets these filters, our household will be in this report. Conversely, if both household members have donations on their timeline, instead of listing them separately, it's going to list their household instead of them as individuals. For individuals or organizations that are not in a household, they're still going to be listed, they're not affected. But this can be very important because You don't want to reach out to my husband, for example, to say, hi, we would like to encourage you to make your first gift of, not knowing or not taking into consideration that there's gifts on my timeline, therefore our household has given. Another thing I want to take a look at here, I'm going to take out this report, is filtering by financial information. So a lot of us might already be familiar with our has transactions filter and going into specific transactions, for example, to filter by date or fund campaign appeal. But if you ever see any of those drop-down arrows, click on them and see what your options are. The calculated here allows you to filter by cumulative giving amounts. So when I say, for example, is between 500 and up, I don't mean constituents who have given a single gift of $500. This means they have cumulatively given at least $500, whether that's 5 gifts of 100 each, 1 gift of 500, 2 gifts of 250. If they've reached that 500 threshold, they're going to be included in this report. Another thing to take a look at, we talked about raised versus revenue versus amount. You can select which amount you want to see or want to count toward that $500. For example, if I only want to see revenue amount, I can select that. So that's actual dollars received. And instead of just all transactions, I'm looking for a specific date range. So going by date, again, we talked a little bit about this earlier, the difference between last year, this year, next year versus last fiscal year, this fiscal year, next fiscal year. Last year takes a look at calendar year versus last fiscal year goes by the fiscal year date in your organization settings. So again, be deliberate. What are you trying to take a look at? And make sure you set that in your organization settings if you want to take a look at fiscal year. So let's say for my organization today, we are going by any household that has given at least $500 in revenue in the last fiscal year. And it's going to give me my results. Again, household means instead of listing constituents in a household individually, it's going to list their household instead, but it will also still include constituents who are not in a household. So that's your financial information. Another thing to take a look at is maybe I want to pair that with my custom field information. So let's say we're going to click and. A common constituent custom field that we see is affiliation. So for example, I want this to go to not just based on the financial information, but also a custom field that we see often is attributes. So for example, not just based on financial information, but I also want to send this to former board members as well as volunteers. I can select that. And you can see how, based on the results, you can adjust your thresholds as needed. Once you're happy with your report, you can save it. And the good thing about this is you can reference this report in a letter or an email or another report. So let's say you're happy with your report, you saved it, you go into an email. So I'm in a pre-made email that I have in my database. Go to your filters, click Add Filter, and look for report. So I'm in a transaction email right now. I have access to transaction reports. So I can click report, select a report, and any transaction report I've already created is available to be selected in my email. So depending on the segment that I've created, I can reference that in this email. Just click on them and then it will automatically pick them up. So essentially you're telling the system, send this email, send this letter to everyone who is in this report. Lovely. And just as a recap, to set up your custom fields, go to settings, and you have options for constituents, transactions, interactions, and notes. A good way to think about where should you be creating those custom fields is where do you want the information to be available and what is the information about? So your constituent custom fields, this would be about your constituent. Whether or not I've given, whether or not I've attended an event, this pertains to me. Most of the segmentation that we've seen will be based on constituents, but you can also absolutely create transaction, interaction, and note custom fields as well. Let's talk about succession planning. This is another area where clean data can really have a major impact. The number one thing that people say that stresses me out when I'm working with them is I'll ask them a question about a data point and they say, oh, so-and-so knows that. If you ever need to know, you just go ask them. Well, what happens if that person is no longer there? You know, what if they win the lottery? What if that person is you? Knowledge is power, and institutional knowledge needs to be documented. It needs to be in your database. I think it's really cool if your grants person, for example, knows off the top of their head exactly what grants are due when and when they need to start writing the grants, and you know what their next steps are. But if they are literally the only one at the organization who knows that, what happens if something catastrophic happens? And your grant reports are still going to be due. What happens if your major gifts officer leaves? Your major donors are still going to need to be cultivated. It is crucial to get as much of that data into the database or to be as accessible as possible. So I really recommend two major things. First, have a data policies or have a policies and procedures manual, both for what is entered into your database and how to do your job day to day. Going back to dramatics, if someone leaves your organization all of a sudden, there's a mass exodus for some reason, and the board has to step in and run to your day-to-day operations while they're also trying to fill positions and continue with your mission, they should be able to follow a guide for how and when to do each of your job duties. And then when that position is filled, the new person should also be able to take up the mantle and continue with your efforts. How many of you have been in those situations where you're the new person coming in and nothing has been documented? Think about that. It's also really, really important to have, you should have a backup at your organization for each of your positions. I know especially a lot of you are wearing multiple hats. Document each of those positions. Shadow somebody else have that person shadow somebody else and have a person to be your designated disaster person for your position. If something happens and your grant reports are due, there's somebody else in that office who knows how to do your grant reports. It is incredibly stressful to walk into a new job and not have any of the passwords or not know how to submit your grant information or what the schedule is or how long your grant periods are or where you are in the process. So being able to cut out that panic from your new person and having to triage the entire situation to figure out what to do is really best for the organization. Now, a word of warning. Beware of data hoarding. When you're creating these policies and procedures, your manuals, and anytime you're entering optional data into the database, optional data would be your custom fields, your non-required fields, make sure that your team is asking two questions. Number one, how is this helping us fundraise? Number two, how is this helping us further our mission? As an example of this, having a custom field where you can record your constituents' favorite animal, for example, may be incredibly helpful if you're an animal welfare agency or an animal rescue agency. But if you're working with people recovering from drug addiction and you're not issuing emotional support animals based on their favorite animal preferences, Does this information help you? You really need to decide if that data is actually helping you fundraise or even if it's relevant to your mission. If the answer is no, don't be afraid to get rid of that data because it is distracting you from your purpose. I know a lot of people, including myself, are wary of deleting data. You can always back it up so you can restore it or import it if that's something you absolutely need. Or take a look at the data that you have now. A lot of you may have inherited your database and not have been included in how it's set up. Take a look at what you have now. How has this helped in your fundraising? Have you used this to help build that relationship with the donor and help you with your fundraising? Is it relevant to your mission? If you haven't touched it, it's just clutter. It's just confusing your data entry and your reporting, and it is distracting you from your purpose. So if at this point you're thinking about your database and you're somewhat panicking, take a deep breath. We have resources to help you get on track. We are aware that there's a lot of cases where it's perfectly acceptable to acknowledge that the way some things have been done have been a bit haphazard or worse, but moving forward, you're going to make some consistent efforts and changes and document them and document the why, and have specific expectations from your staff and from anyone who's touching your database. Anyone who is going into your database need to have access to what your policies and procedures are so they understand how to enter information and they don't just change information that's in there, and they understand how to pull information out if they're running reports. We have additional academy classes that talk about this. I know we didn't go into, we have a class on database management essentials. If you need some cleanup, we have a class on clean up your data to improve your fundraising. We have some coaching and consulting services that can help you. So if you need a little bit of guidance, setting up what your data sets should be and how you should track your organization's efforts. If you need help with an audit, there's so much data to go over. We have resources that can help you with that. If you're interested in any of our products or services, let us know in the poll. You can also reach out anytime to customer.accounts@bloomerang.com and they can help you get set up. Also, don't forget you have access to our Bloomerang knowledge base and our support team. The most important button in your Bloomerang database is that question mark button on the top right. That gives you access to our help videos. You can email our support team. You can initiate a live chat. If you need someone to talk through those options, we have free resources that can help you with this. I hope that this has been helpful for you today. I know there's so much more we could talk about, and there's so much more you could do within your database. Please don't hesitate to reach out. I hope that this has given you some things to think about as you think about how you want to track your data moving forward and how you can set up your nonprofit for success. Thank you everyone for joining me today, and have a great rest of your day. Bye.